Thank you, Rowena, and thank you all for being here this evening. A couple of years ago, I spoke here about Abraham Lincoln. Tonight, I'm talking about D.C. Stephenson. From the sublime to the slime. For tonight, we're going to sit in the curb and dangle our feet into the muck and filth of political corruption, sexual violence, and murder. Aren't you glad you came? Now, every good story needs a good cast of characters. And our story is no exception. For our villain, we have David Curtis Stephenson, a man who held no political office, elected or appointed, but would often exclaim, "I am the law in Indiana, the law and the power." And you know, for a long time, he was right. For our heroes, we have three. We have William Remy, the prosecutor who brought Stephenson down. We have Asa Smith, the attorney who made it possible to bring him down. And we have Governor Warren T. McRae, the only Hoosier governor who ever went directly from the governor's office to the penitentiary. And yet, he is my hero, and I hope to make him yours. And of course, for our victim, we have Madge Oberholtzer. Now, I personally have a third-hand hearsay relationship with Madge Oberholtzer. Over 55 years ago in high school, I had a wonderful high school teacher who sat back one day and gave us an abbreviated rendition of the story I'm going to tell you this evening. Now, this teacher of mine, his mother-in-law, a very prim and proper lady, she married a missionary who would never say anything bad about anyone, had been a sorority sister with Madge Oberholtzer. And she would only say that Madge was not a very substantial person. On the other hand, the same teacher I had once taught school with another school teacher who had in turn taught alongside Madge during Madge's brief time as a school teacher, and she said she was a nice young girl. I'm afraid you're going to have to make up your own mind this evening, but either way, Madge Oberholtzer did not deserve the tragic fate she suffered at the hands of D.C. Stephenson. And so we began. Once upon a time, a long, long time ago, 1865, in a land far, far away, Pulaski, Tennessee, 6 men came together to form an organization called the Ku Klux Klan. It was more or less a fraternal lodge of white supremacists who wore funny costumes, had secret words at a ritual, and rode horses around at night and presumably had a good time. Soon, however, it was seen that this group could be used as a terrorist organization to intimidate blacks, carpetbaggers, and scallywags through threats, whippings, and murder, and maintain social control over the black community so that the white supremacist South could win the peace after losing the war. Soon, the former Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest was chosen to lead the Klan. If you learn nothing else tonight, you will learn that there have been 3 distinct Ku Klux Klans in American history. This one was the first, and it lasted for 7 years. Forrest had reluctantly officially abolished it in 1869, And in 1872, the Grant administration was able to shut it down in practice. To his credit, Forrest made an effort toward racial harmony in later years, but from 1865 to 1872, the Ku Klux Klan was evil personified. Then after the turn of the 20th century, the novelist Thomas J. Dixon Jr. wrote the book, The Klansman, which portrayed the Ku Klux Klan as a noble group of Christian patriots saving virginal Southern white men from the ever-rapacious libidos of ignorant and savage blacks. Then, in 1915, D.W. Griffith made the great but controversial movie Birth of a Nation, which proved to be extremely popular. When it was shown at the White House, Woodrow Wilson, our first Southern president since the Civil War, said the movie was all too terribly true. Within this was the first president who segregated the bureaucracy of the federal government. For 50 years, since the Civil War was over and white bureaucrats had been content to work alongside Southern black government workers, but only Southern-born Woody thought it not right and ruled by executive order that the federal workers be segregated. The Klansman and Birth of a Nation were coincident with the revival of the Ku Klux Klan and its second appearance in American history. This was done by Colonel William J. Simmons, a former Methodist minister and a chronic joiner who claimed to hold 23 degrees from 7 fraternal groups besides the Klan. The title Colonel was awarded to him by the Woodman of the world. He became the first self-proclaimed imperial wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, and the incorporation papers for that organization were filed in Atlanta the day before the premiere of Birth of a Nation. The movie proved to be a great recruiting tool for the Klan. In the 5 years since he began the Second Klan, Simmons had been unsuccessful in spreading membership to the North. But in 1920, he hired Edward Young Clark and Elizabeth Tyler, who ran a public relations firm. They were geniuses in promoting the Klan nationally and were the first to instigate the Ponzi scheme, where the recruiter of a new Klan member got a substantial cut in the new member's membership fee. Such cuts were set aside for several levels of leadership in the Klan, and members were required to purchase the hooded sheet costume, and officers got a cut from that as well. The very poor were excluded from Klan membership by its cost. Counting the $10 membership fee, monthly dues, and cost of the robe and other paraphernalia, the first year membership cost $3.50, or $23.50, which comes to $335 in 2018 dollars. It was not cheap to be in the Klan, and millions were generated for Klan office holders. We are all acquainted with some of the strange and sometimes silly names the Klan gave for every aspect of Klan activity, from offices to behaviors. Cyclops, wizard, dragon carry a certain cachet, but the initiation fee was the Kleck token, and the Clabby was the treasurer. Looking at the list of officers, I thought that had I been a Klansman, I would probably be a Clud. It sounded right up my alley until I noticed that the Clud was the chaplain. Not my style. However, had I been a Clud, I could aspire to state level, where I would have been the Grand Clud. And had I risen to the national level, the Imperial Clud. I'm not making this up. As the Klan gained in national scope, in late 1922, a palace coup abetted by D.C. Stephenson replaced Simmons as a national leader, or imperial wizard, with a Texas dentist named Hiram Wesley Evans. Well, who was this D.C. Stephenson? David Curtis Stephenson was born August 21st, 1891, probably in Houston, Texas. His father was a poor sharecropper, and the family moved to Oklahoma in 1901. When he was young, Stephenson worked for different newspapers and once helped on the campaign for the socialist candidate for governor. He left home in 1914 and continued to work for newspapers as a typesetter and/or reporter and sometimes editor. In 1915, he married Nettie Hamilton, and a daughter, Florence Catherine, was born in 1916. He soon lost his job, abandoned his wife and child, and became a drifter. This became a pattern with Stephenson. He would work for a newspaper, start drinking and carousing, and soon move on. Once he moved on with $800 of the publisher's money. He was a second lieutenant in the Iowa National Guard during World War I, and although he claimed later to be a war hero with service in Europe, he never left the States. Another characteristic of D.C. Stephenson was he was an inveterate liar. Nettie filed for divorce in 1917. In mid-1919, he was a traveling salesman selling typesetting machines and printing equipment, and met and married wife number 2, Violet Carroll, in Akron, Ohio. They were married in January 1920 and moved to Evansville, Indiana, where he went to work selling coal. Throughout his Klan tenure, he continued to work for coal companies. He soon tried to run for Congress in Evansville as a Democrat, but failed to obtain the nomination. Hiram Wesley Evans decided to further promote the Klan in the North, and he picked Joe Huffington to be the point man in Indiana. He moved to Evansville in early 1920, and within a few months, he met D.C. Stephenson, who was trying to start a new veterans organization. Huffington recognized that Stephenson was a born salesman and put him to work immediately as a recruiter for Klan membership in Indiana. Soon, Indiana became the strongest Klan state in the United States, with over 30% of all white native-born men as members. Soon, Simmons made Stephenson responsible for recruitment in 20 northern states. To understand how popular the Klan became nationally and especially in Indiana during this time, we must stop and look closely at the Klan and the state of the country in the late teens and early 1920s. During World War I, the patriotic organization that was pro-native-born American and anti-foreigners had attraction. After all, we were currently in the business of killing foreigners overseas. There had been some bloody race riots in 1919. The immediate post-war years were fraught with labor violence, a recession economy, and the Red Scare promulgated by the federal Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, in which Bolsheviks, aliens, anarchists, and labor organizers were rounded up and deported. Remember that the 20s were rife with the type of social unrest that we experienced in the 60s. The youth were flaunting their sexual liberation, prohibition was resulting in law and order issues of concern, and the whole social fabric seemed in disarray. Enter now the Ku Klux Klan, which, while it was a racist organization, was definitely against blacks, Catholics, and Jews. In the North, and especially in Indiana, it did not emphasize that aspect of its beliefs. Its leading issue was law and order, and its support for prohibition. It claimed that police and government officials were corrupt and in not enforcing prohibition, which was all too true. It wanted reform in government to eliminate corruption, an emphasis on old-time values in the school system, and it certainly emphasized old-time religion, which of course was Protestant. In the words of the modern day, as well as the Klan slogan at the time, the Klan was for family values and for a moral stability in seemingly immoral times. This was a common scene at the time. Generally, with prior approval of the minister, a delegation of Klansmen would enter a church during Sunday services. They would kneel and quietly pray and then leave a money donation on the altar. People today normally think of Klan rallies or initiations with their cross burnings. But the Klan had cradle-to-the-grave rituals. Here we have a wedding. Here we have a funeral. That picture was taken just outside Ellettsville, Indiana. The burning cross was an element introduced by the Stuckey Klan, but it was rarely ever used as a form of personal intimidation. In Indiana, it was not burned on the lawns of Klan opponents, but was usually a part of the outdoor rituals or conclaves. Evans advocated a return to, quote, the everyday, not highly cultured, but entirely unspoiled and not de-Americanized average citizen of the old stock. It proved an extremely popular appeal, and we must not forget the Klan in Indiana did not espouse violence as a part of its outreach. Stephenson was against violence and rarely talked about the anti-black Catholic or Jew part of Klan beliefs in his speeches. Remember, Stephenson had no deep beliefs in much of anything. He had been a socialist, a Democrat, and then a Republican. He didn't believe in ideology. He believed in power and money for D.C. Stephenson. There were no Klan lynchings of blacks in Indiana during the Klan era. As the percentages quoted earlier show, the Klan was extremely popular in Indiana, more so than any other northern state. Remember that the second Klan of the 1920s was different from the first Reconstruction Klan or the third modern civil rights era Klan, which was made up of mostly low-life bottom feeders of the worst sort, the scum of society. But if you have any relatives who were Klansmen or women in the 1920s, and some of you probably do, there is no reason to be ashamed of someone who espoused the importance of honesty in government, enhanced public schools, old-time religion, and the proper enforcement of laws of the land, especially prohibition. Those were the issues pressed by the Klan at the local level. In Indiana, when the Klan did emphasize any of its despicable, intolerant beliefs, it was its anti-Catholic bias rather than its anti-black or anti-Semitic views. Klan propaganda in Indiana was skilled at making its racial or religious bigotry not directed at the person down the street that you have known all your life, but at the stranger or immigrant that was scheming to move in down the street. Now you must remember that my description is of the Klan in the North and especially in Indiana. In the South and Southwest in the United States, violence, especially anti-black violence, was still a part of the Klan. It is important to remember that this was a golden time for fraternal organizations with Masons, Elks, Oddfellows, Woodmen of the World, the Order of the Red Man, Knights of Pythias, and on and on. The Klan was pitched to the public as a fraternal organization and had a program that proved very attractive in troubled times. Stephenson was just the salesman who could make the numbers of Klansmen what they became in Indiana. In 1922, Stephenson and Violet moved to Indianapolis, where he continued to sell coal and lead the Klan recruitment. His troubled marriage had a history of violence, and Violet moved out in August of 1922 and sued him for divorce. That was final in February of 1924. He purchased an elegant house in Irvington, a suburb just east of Indianapolis, and had it extensively remodeled, adding the columns, among other things. He bought a yacht named the Riomar II, which he kept at a port in Toledo, Ohio. For D.C. Stephenson, the money just rolled in. In the Klan elections in Indiana in 1924, in which the infamous Klan legislature was elected, they also elected Ed Jackson, the former Secretary of State and friend of D.C. Stephenson, and all the state offices except for auditor and clerk of the Supreme Court. The candidate for auditor was a Republican, but it angered the Klan by not supporting it in the ouster of a Catholic school teacher, and the Republican candidate for clerk of the Supreme Court was a Catholic. In Marion County, only 3 candidates for the legislature on the Republican ticket lost. One was black, one was a Catholic, and one was a Jew. They elected the 8 other Klan-supported Republicans. Throughout its brief reign, the Klan was overwhelmingly, but not exclusively, Republican. There were Democrats that the Klan supported. One was our Democrat, United States Senator Samuel M. Ralston. This period from 1922 through 1925 was the peak time for Klan power and influence of D.C. Stephenson in Indiana. From his office in the 8-room suite encompassing the entire 3rd floor of the S.S. Kresge building in Indianapolis, he controlled many politicians, bureaucrats, and lobbyists around the state. A few stories will suffice. One of the 8 telephones in Stephenson's Indianapolis office was a fake one that was marked as a direct line to the Oval Office in Washington. Stephenson was known to, at times during meetings with politicians or lobbyists, to have to excuse himself to take a private call from the president. When you look up chutzpah in the dictionary, there's a little picture of D.C. Stephenson. Would I lie to you about the dictionary? Yes. About the fake phone? No. When the Republican but anti-Klan mayor, of Indianapolis, Samuel Lewis Leather-Lunged Lou, he was a famous orator. Leather-Lunged Lou Shank was defeated by the pro-Klan Republican John L. Duval. Duval had signed a contract with Stephenson, promising that for his support, he would clear all appointments and official decisions with Stephenson. Warren T. McRae had been a Republican governor elected in 1920, the election before 1924. He was anti-Klan. He was one of the wealthiest farmers in Indiana and worth about $3 million. He had expanded his farming business just prior to the economic post-war downturn and was caught in extreme financial difficulty. He did some suspicious things to try to save his farm, and the grand jury of Marion County wanted to look into it. The Marion County prosecutor was the son-in-law of Governor McRae. He recused himself, and a temporary replacement prosecutor led the grand jury that resulted in the governor being indicted. Then the son-in-law prosecutor resigned his office, and it was the governor's job to appoint a new Marion County prosecutor. At a meeting in Indianapolis, D.C. Stephenson and Ed Jackson, the current Secretary of State at the time, put $10,000 into a briefcase and sent a third man as a messenger over to the governor's office to tell them that if he would appoint their recommended Klan man to the prosecutor's office, the money was his. The money was a drop in the bucket of what the governor owed, but far more importantly, the new Klan prosecutor would then promise that the indictment of the governor would go nowhere, or at the very least, be strung out interminably. Governor McRae threw him out of his office, whereupon he returned to Jackson and Stephenson. Jackson opined that the messenger had not explained the situation properly to the governor, and he took the briefcase over to McRae and went through the bribe proposition again. Furious, the governor announced that his fortune and good name might be in ruins, but he still had his integrity. And he threw Jackson out. The governor would appoint his own man to be the Marion County prosecutor, and that man was Will J. Remy, the man who would later prosecute D.C. Stephenson for murder. Now do you see why Governor McRae is my hero? Yes. McRae was indicted, and although the state court resulted in a hung jury, a federal court found him guilty of mail fraud, and he had to resign as governor and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. He was paroled after 3 years, and in 1930, President Hoover pardoned him. The lieutenant governor served out his term, and in 1924, Ed Jackson, the Secretary of State, ran for governor with Klan support and won. In 1923, a schism developed in the Klan leadership, and Evans replaced Stephenson with Walter Bossert as Grand Dragon of the Indiana Klan, and Stephenson withdrew Indiana from its national affiliation and declared himself the Grand Dragon of an independent Indiana Klan. Rare among Klan leaders, Bossert was an honest bigot who genuinely believed in the Klan cause and was not out for personal gain. He treated both his political friends and his enemies honorably. Mainstream Klansmen in Indiana were confused with the status of their leadership. While both men attempted to exercise power, it is safe to say that Stephenson, the more astute and born salesman that he was, continued to control the political influence of the Klan in Indiana. The general non-Klan public was probably unaware of the split. It is interesting for a moment to see the relative difference between the two men in their behavior when the Klan did control, more or less, the infamous Klan legislature that took control in 1925. In the House, proposed legislation called for prohibition of religious garb in public schools aimed at Catholic nuns who taught in public schools. Bible reading was to be required for teachers to read in the classrooms, also to teach state and federal constitutions. Teacher qualification required that teachers in Indiana public schools to have been educated in Indiana public schools. 2 hours each week of religious education were to be mandated. And the American flag was to be displayed in every classroom. This bill actually passed, but it was already being done in most schools anyway. And there would be an abolition of parochial schools. And it also called for fines or jail time for parents who sent their children to parochial schools. There would be a textbook requirement. It required Catholic schools to use the same textbooks used in public schools. And there would be movie censorship, the establishment of a state commission to censor immoral motion pictures. And these were very similar proposals that were made in legislatures all over the United States. Bossert's Klan supported legislation to drive Catholics out of the education field, to tighten the state's responsibilities over moral questions, and to increase public education, patriot education in public schools. While Bossert's legislation may have been bigoted, it was an accurate interpretation of what his Klansmen wanted. On the other hand, Stephenson's legislation was blatantly designed to accomplish one thing: to win Stephenson more political power and make him a great deal of money. Stephenson's legislative agenda consisted of a highway commission reform bill, stripping the existing commission of power and making a new commission directly responsible to the governor. These would be Klan appointments that Jackson would make. There would be a nutrition bill, which mandated education on nutrition in public schools and required the use of a textbook that Stephenson just happened to be writing. There was a fire insurance bill. Stephenson didn't support it, but he made sure it was introduced in order to have lobbyists to pay him to have it killed. There was a utility reform bill. He had his bill imposing strict regulations, and then he sought money from the utility companies to have it killed as well. There was an oleomargarine bill. It called for more descriptive labeling on packages, and presumably Stephenson collected money from the dairy industry to have it passed. There was a stream pollution bill, which regulated what industries could dump in streams. Stephenson collected money from industries to kill it. That so much of the Klan legislation did not pass may be attributed to the House being dominated by the Bossert faction, while the Senate was more influenced by the Stephenson faction. Although Stephenson was flying high politically and financially, his private life betrayed the scurrilous background that had gone before. In early 1923, he took his young female secretary to Columbus, Ohio, where he was working. They dated and became engaged, and in June 1923, he was found along the road, parked in the back seat of the car in a compromising position with the girl. He pled guilty to a parking violation and indecent exposure on the highway and paid $17.50 in fines and costs. In early 1924, at a party at his home in Irvington, a young actress claimed that Stephenson tried to rape her and in the process did bite her. And also in 1924, he spent a day in a Columbus, Ohio jail because he had assaulted a manicurist in a hotel. The hotel and woman were paid off, and the incident came to an end, but was in the Columbus papers. In these violent incidents, Stephenson had been drinking. He was what is called a mean drunk. Madge Oberholtzer was a 28-year-old unmarried woman who worked for the Indiana Department of Public Education and lived with her parents in Irvington, about 2 blocks from D.C. Stephenson. She had 3 years at Butler and was a Pi Beta Phi sorority, but she did not graduate. She taught school for a time. Her parents were falling on financial hard times and had to take in boarders. One of them was Charles Householder, who was living apart from his wife, with whom he was having marital troubles. In January 1925, Madge met D.C. Stephenson at the inaugural dinner for the new governor, Ed Jackson. They dated, but Madge, in her dying declaration, claimed that they only went out 4 times. On Sunday, March 15th, 1925, Madge had a date at 5 o'clock from which she returned home by 10 o'clock. Her mother told her she had a call from D.C. Stephenson's secretary and that she should return it as it was important. She did so and found out that Stephenson was leaving town and needed to speak with her before he left about the book she was helping him write. This was the book on nutrition that would be used when the legislature passed the law mandating nutrition education in the public schools. He had previously purchased a small publishing house in anticipation of his scheme. Madge had been hired to help him with the book. He sent Earl Gentry, one of his bodyguards, to escort Madge over to his house. The next morning, Monday, March 16th, Matilda Oberholtzer, Madge's mother, called the family attorney, Asa Smith, to say that Madge left the night before to see D.C. Stephenson, but had not yet returned. She was concerned. Later, she called to say that she had received a telegram from Madge saying, "We are driving through to Chicago and will be home on the night train," signed Madge. Smith tried to reassure Madge's mother not to worry, but he called Emina Moore, a longtime friend of Madge's who was working at the State House in the same department, and explained the situation, hoping that she might know something. That Monday night on the Union Station platform, the attorney, the mother, and Emina Moore waited. No Madge. That same Monday night at about 11 o'clock, the attorney Smith, Madge's mother, and Emina Moore went to Stephenson's home in Irvington. While the two women were at the front door being told that the inhabitants did not know where Stephenson was, Smith saw from his parked car across the street a car enter the Stephensons' driveway and head to the detached three-car garage behind the house. It turned out later that, unknown to Smith, Madge was in that car. He took the ladies home, and the next day, Tuesday, met with both of Madge's parents in the office of a private detective. After the parents left, he got a call from them saying that Madge was home. While they had been meeting with Smith and the detective, a man who turned out later to be Earl Klink, another bodyguard of Stephenson's, carried Madge into her home and up the stairs into her bedroom. He said only that she had been in an auto accident, but he didn't think any bones were broken. Eunice Schultz, a boarder, had been at home and reported all this. She said that Madge was groaning, was bruised, said she was dying, and asked Schultz to call the family doctor. Dr. John K. Kingsbury came immediately and saw, in addition to the bruises, lacerations or cuts on her left chest. Madge told him she did not expect or want to get well, but she wanted to die. Over the next few days, Madge related to Dr. Kingsbury, attorney Asa Smith, and her friend Emina Moore what had happened to her, and they took extensive notes of what she said. Madge told them that when she got to Stephenson's house on Sunday night, he was drunk. She wanted to go home, but he wouldn't let her. She tried twice to call home, but the phone was taken out of her hands. She was forced to take 2 or 3 drinks herself and was forced into the car and taken downtown to Union Station, where she, Stephenson, and Gentry boarded the train. While in a private compartment, Stephenson pulled her dress over her head and then ripped the rest of her clothes off. Then he bit, chewed, pummeled, and raped her. They got off the train in Hammond, Indiana, just short of the state line, and went to the Indiana Hotel in Hammond. There, Stephenson signed them into the hotel under an assumed married name of Mr. and Mrs. Morgan. He forced her to send the telegram to her parents and dictated what she was to say. Later that Monday morning, she asked for some money to buy some cosmetics and a hat. She was given $15 and was taken to the hat store by Ernest W. Shorty DeFries, Stephenson's chauffeur, who had driven a car to Hammond. There he allowed her to go in alone and buy a hat. Then they went to a drugstore where again he allowed her to go in alone, where she bought some bichloride of mercury. This was a common disinfectant and was sometimes used in suicide attempts. The wife of actor Lon Chaney Sr. had tried to kill herself with bichloride of mercury in 1913. Shorty then escorted her back to the hotel where at about 10 o'clock she tried to take 18 tablets but ended up taking only 6 before she got sick. It was not until about 4 o'clock that afternoon that she told Shorty she had committed suicide. Stephenson was mad and made her drink a bottle of milk. He offered to take her to the hospital, but she would have to register as his wife. Madge refused. He then ordered her into the car for the drive back to Indianapolis. She said that after she arrived at Stephenson's house that Monday evening, late, she begged Stephenson to call a doctor, but he told her she would stay right where she was unless she agreed to marry him. He said to her, "I am the law and the power." On the next morning, Tuesday, Clink carried her home. For the next few weeks, Asa Smith was in and out of the Oberholtzer's home, and Madge's friend, Ermina Moore, visited her every day. There was a professional nurse who stayed in the house. On the morning of March 26th, 9 days after Madge had been carried home, Smith got a call from Madge's father, George, that Dr. Kingsbury said that Madge was dying and the lawyers should try and get a formal statement from her. That day, Smith called Ermina Moore to his office. The two of them pooled their notes they had been taking as Madge related her experiences, and Smith wrote a single document that contained information from them both. The next morning, Saturday the 28th, Mr. Oberholtzer again called and said Madge was declining. Smith, Moore, and another lawyer went to the Oberholtzers with a notary. They went over the document with Madge, and she admitted that she knew she was dying. After making some changes in the document based on Madge's comments, she signed it, and then after the notary came into the room, she signed a separate document that had been made in the form of an affidavit. This became the dying declaration of Madge Oberholtzer. When Smith got home that day, he got a call from Will Remy, the Marion County prosecutor, asking him if there was something he had better see Smith about. Smith said yes, and right away. They met the next day on Sunday, March 29th. On Thursday, April 2nd, a warrant was issued for the arrest of Stephenson on charges of assault and battery with intent to commit murder and kidnapping and conspiracy to commit felony. Gentry and Clink were also arrested. After their arrest, all three were let out on bail. Stephenson paid a $25,000 bond, and the others were $5,000 each. The county officials were all Klan affiliated, so from the sheriff on down, there was little cooperation. The city government, however, was still under the waning months of the anti-Klan Shank administration. So the city police were very thorough in their investigation of this incident and in ferreting out Stephenson's background with women. They located several witnesses that confirmed all of Madge's story, including the employees of the hotel in Hammond that remembered them and porters on the train that also remembered them. They never located the drugstore or the millinery where she bought the bichloride of mercury or the hat. The one part of Madge's story that did not prove true was that she said that she threw the empty bottle of bichloride of mercury out of the window of the hotel room, hotel bathroom. Detectives found that the hotel bathroom had no window. On April 2nd, Madge slipped into a coma, and on April 14th, she died. Dr. Paul F. Robinson was the coroner of Marion County and pro-Klan. He arranged for an autopsy to be performed by Dr. Virgil H. Moon, who taught pathology at the IU Medical School. The charges were soon changed to murder, and all three were rearrested and held without bail. Madge was buried on April 16th. Jury selection began on October 12, 1925 at Noblesville in Hamilton County. There had been a change of venue and a change of judge. Judge Will Sparks was 53 years old from Rushville, and later he would have a distinguished career on the federal bench. For 16 days, 260 people were interviewed before 10 farmers, a businessman, and a truck driver were selected for the jury. At the time, it was thought to be the longest time in the history of Indiana for a jury to be selected. While the process was continuing, on October 14th, after a long illness, United States Senator Samuel M. Ralston died. It was thought that had Stephenson not been otherwise engaged as the defendant in a murder trial, he would have been selected by Governor Jackson to fill out the vacated term of Senator Ralston. The prosecution, after getting her dying declaration admitted as evidence, concentrated on proving the cause of death was blood poisoning from the infected bite wounds that Stephenson had inflicted on Madge while raping her. The coroner insisted Madge's death was due to her suicide attempt. The leading defense lawyer was Ephraim F. Inman, the leading criminal defense attorney in Indianapolis. The strategy of the defense was to keep the dying declaration out of evidence, and they lost that early. Then they concentrated on proving that Madge had died of the effects of the poison, which she took herself, and that was suicide and not murder. They also brought up that bichloride of mercury was used diluted vaginally as an abortion inducer. The Klan's coroner's findings had said that her cause of death was the mercury poisoning and the manner of death of suicide. They said that the kidnapping charge was absurd as she had been taken through Union Station and had not cried out for help. The prosecutors answered these comments by pointing out that no woman, good or bad, leaves her home for a trip without a hat, coat, or lingerie. Observers thought the defense was less than aggressive, and Stephenson didn't testify in his own behalf, which, of course, he did not have to. The defense tried once to impugn Madge's reputation when they placed Cora Householder on the stand. They wanted her to testify that Madge had wrecked her marriage by having an affair with her husband, Charles, who you will recall was boarding at the Oberholtzers. After much arguing and objecting out of the presence of the jury, the judge ruled that she would not be allowed to testify. On the other hand, the prosecution did not enter any of Stephenson's awful history with women, but they did get it in that he drank a lot. It is probably true that Stephenson wasn't worried too much about the trial because he anticipated a pardon by Governor Jackson. He hinted as much to reporters. The jury deliberated 5 hours and 38 minutes. They later said that Stephenson was found guilty on the first ballot, but the rest of the time was spent on the degree of guilt and the other two men. Stephenson was found guilty, but Gentry and Klink were acquitted. The trial was over on November 14th, 1925, and he was sentenced to life in prison on November 16th. He would spend 31 years in prison, more than any other person convicted of second-degree murder in Indiana. Stephenson laid low in prison for several months, but when the pardon never materialized, he wanted to talk to reporters. The warden only allowed visits by lawyers or family. He was able to sneak letters out by way of corrupt prison guards and into the hands of Martha Dickinson, a married lady from Seymour, who was a longtime admirer of Stephenson. She passed those letters on to reporters. The letters simply said that Stephenson had a lot of things to say that Indiana readers might be interested in. The reporters replied, in essence, "Give us some goods." And he did. He began to reveal much of the corruption and eventually told them where his little black boxes full of incriminating stuff was kept. Mayor Duval of Indianapolis was tried and convicted and forced to resign. The governor, Ed Jackson, was tried for attempting to bribe Governor McRae, but he was acquitted because of the lapse in the statute of limitations. In 1930, Stephenson tried an appeal in which he claimed that Madge had been made pregnant by Charles Householder, and her good friend D.C. Stephenson was just taking her to Gary to have an abortion, which resulted in her infection. He had an affidavit from Dr. Mabel Fowles, F-A-U-L-D-S, Fowles, who said she did the abortion on a lady at the time who looked like Madge. There was a real Dr. Fowles who many years after all this was convicted of performing illegal abortions. The police did not investigate Stephenson's claims in 1930, and he stayed in prison. In 1939 and again in 1945, he made his appeals. Both of them were rejected. In 1950, Governor Henry Schricker granted him a parole contingent upon his getting a job in Illinois and staying there. Instead, he went to Oklahoma to live with his daughter. He was thus a parole violator and was arrested and sent back to prison. 6 years later, Governor George N. Craig gave him a complete discharge from prison on December 26, 1956. He moved to Seymour, where he married wife number 3, the widow Martha Dickinson, who helped him smuggle the letters out of prison 30 years before. In 1961, he was arrested in Independence, Missouri on a charge of attempting to molest a 16-year-old girl. He tried to push her into his car. The judge fined him $300 and ordered him out of the state. He went back to Martha in Seymour, but 1 year later they were separated. Sometime in 1962, he left Indiana, never to return. On June 28, 1966, in Jonesboro, Tennessee, he died in the arms of wife number 3 1/2. He had married Martha Murray Sutton in 1964 when she was 55 and he was 74. He was working for a local newspaper and selling a type cleaning machine of his own invention. He just hadn't got around to divorcing wife number 3, and thus I can only call her wife number 3 1/2. Martha knew nothing of this and remembered him as a kindly man who loved children. After the Stephenson trial and the exposure of political corruption, the Klan in both Indiana and the nation quickly declined as anything of importance. As much as the notoriety of D.C. Stephenson and the dishonesty of so many Klan-sponsored politicians was the lack of any concrete legislative accomplishments by Klan politicians when in office. The many well-intentioned members of the Klan soon saw that they were being sold out by the quality of the Klan leadership, which as a general rule was only interested in self-aggrandizement. The best history of all this, is the book Grand Dragon, D.C. Stephenson and the Ku Klux Klan in Indiana by M. William Lutholz. It was published in 1991. Mr. Lutholz was as convinced of Stephenson's guilt as I am, and the jury was, but he brings up some interesting points. First, at the trial, the defense attorneys couldn't remember the name of the notary who witnessed Madge signing the dying declaration. They were so attentive to every legal detail, but missed this. She was never identified or found. Odd. It still seems odd that Madge could go alone into stores to buy stuff in Hammond when supposedly she had been raped and was being held against her will. And 3, Lutholz thought that she picked an unusual choice of poisons to try to commit suicide. He thought she might have been pregnant or thought she was pregnant, and her attempt to induce an abortion went terribly wrong. It is also possible that her suicide attempt was a fake one that went terribly wrong. And he thought the notion that she would try to kill herself just because she had been raped struck Ludholtz as old-fashioned, even in 1925, especially for a 28-year-old. And finally, there was a curious unwillingness of the court to allow any of Madge's character to be questioned. Could be the judge was just an old-fashioned gentleman, although we must remember that none of Stephenson's violent history with women was introduced either. Stephenson changed his story from time to time, and he never ceased being a chronic liar. His last word on his own guilt or innocence was provided in a letter he wrote to an Indianapolis newspaper. I should have been put in jail for my political activities, but I'm not guilty of murder. For years, I thought that sounded at least interesting from a man with nothing to gain. Now, I see how he could very well have been guilty of all that was charged, but feel sincerely that he was not guilty of murder. From I am not guilty of murder to I did not have sex with that woman. Beware political leaders who define their own moral terms.